Hello, I'm Hazm Seeker. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and economics. This week,
powerful sanctions will go into full effect. If the regime continues its nuclear aspirations, it will have bigger problems than it has ever had before.
Iran fallout, how the U.S. decision to exit the nuclear deal is being felt around the world. Also this week, a cry for financial help, why Argentina is going back to the International Monetary Fund years after the country defaulted on its debt. Plus,
I'm Andrew Simmons reporting on the continuing rains and floods in Kenya. And I'll be explaining how this river has changed course completely, destroying homes, farms and cash crops.
So the world's biggest economy reimposes sanctions on the Islamic Republic of Iran. It's a decision which has implications for the global oil market and multi-billion-dollar business deals. On this week's show, we'll look at who will pay the economic price. European companies like Total, Airbus, Siemens and Renault are nervously looking at their options. They could risk losing access to the US market and face fines if they choose to do business with Iran. The US decision to walk away from the 2015 nuclear deal also threatens to cut off a chunk of the world's crude oil supply, and that's sending oil prices up. We'll be looking at the fallout and what sectors of the global economy are taking the biggest hits in just a few moments. But first, Zain Basravi has the reaction from Tehran.
The day after the United States tore up the nuclear deal, Iran set it on fire. Members of parliament in Tehran burned a printout of the international pact and the American flag, a show of anger and disappointment over what they say is a mistake by Washington.
If Europe and important countries like Russia and China fill this international vacuum, perhaps there will be a way to continue. Otherwise, the Islamic Republic of Iran will bring the US to its senses with its nuclear actions. They have to know that under such circumstances, Iran has no commitment to remain in the nuclear position it was in before.
Iranians woke up to headlines that highlight the country's internal divisions. Moderates, who are currently in government, want the deal to go on without Trump. Hardliners stress the United States cannot be trusted and the agreement should be completely scrapped. But both sides are bracing for an economic impact.
The withdrawal means more pressure will be exerted on the people, and the country will go back to the days of resorting to smuggling to bring in goods and bypass sanctions.
On Wednesday, Iran's Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei drew a line in the sand.
You all heard last night the cheap and impudent remarks of the US president. There were maybe more than 10 lies in what he said. He threatened both the establishment and the Iranian nation that he will do this and that. And I will tell him on behalf of the Iranian people, Mr. Trump, like hell you will.
While there is a sliver of hope for the deal to survive, Khamenei said he knows Iran is asking the remaining signatories for the impossible: to stand by Iran and ignore the global financial threat posed by the United States.
Now it's said that the agreement will stay in place with participation of the 3 European countries. I do not trust these 3 countries.
While the full impacts of renewed sanctions have yet to materialize on Iranian streets, traditional chants of death to America are getting louder once again.
So here's a look at what else is at stake globally. Now, the price of oil is at its highest since 2014. Iran is currently the world's 5th largest oil producer, and it's accused rivals of trying to steal market share. Saudi Arabia said it was ready to step in to stabilize markets. French oil company Total has agreed to help Iran develop the world's largest gas field, South Pars. Now it's looking at whether it has to exit that deal. Other oil companies, BP and Royal Dutch Shell, could also take a hit. In aviation, Airbus and Boeing have deals in place worth nearly $40 billion. The largest deal was for Iran Air to buy 100 planes from Airbus. Car makers Renault, PSA and Volkswagen have moved back into Iran. About 120 German companies operate there. Now, China is the biggest buyer of Iranian crude, so with European companies starting to count potential losses, their withdrawal from Iran could open the door to Chinese firms. Now, the European Union wants to calm tensions and salvage the deal with Iran. A French government spokesman said EU partners could fight the sanctions under world trade rules.
The European Union is ready to challenge at the WTO any unilateral measure that would hurt the interests of European companies and respond in an appropriate manner, in accordance, of course, with the rules of that international organization.
Well, joining us now from Vienna is Bijan Khajipour, managing partner of Austria-based consulting firm RTA International. Good to have you with us. So let's talk first of all about Iran's economy, which is not in great shape to begin with. How is the US withdrawing from this deal going to affect ordinary Iranians in how they do business with the world?
Well, there are different dimensions to this development. One is obviously psychological, and we have been witnessing the psychological impact over the past few weeks in anticipation of this announcement. For example, on the currency market in Iran, you can imagine that a lot of people are anxious about the consequences of this decision by President Trump. And the economy in general has not been in a very good shape, partly because the expectations that the Iranian people and also the Iranian business community had from the implementation of the JCPOA have not been realized. And now, obviously, there has been a lot of uncertainty, and there will be more uncertainty with this withdrawal from the US side. Obviously, one can imagine that a number of international companies and banks will reconsider their Iran strategy, and that will definitely have an impact.
Yeah, that's a key issue, isn't it? Is how the European partners in this deal will respond to this, because they have said that they want to continue to honor the deal. But might the threat perhaps of being in the crosshairs of the US government imposing their sanctions be enough to steer business away from Iran altogether? Or will they try to sort of cushion that blow?
The Europeans will certainly try to cushion that blow, but you have to look at the situation from the perspective of international companies. I mean, there will be, in my analysis, 3 different groups of companies in Europe. The most significant group are the larger European companies that have relatively extensive interests in the US. I mean, they probably export to the US market. They probably have interactions with American banks, with American stock exchanges, and so on. And they're obviously the most exposed group to potential US sanctions. So one can imagine, no matter what kind of protection the EU offers, that those companies will be very careful unless they manage to secure the so-called OFAC licenses they need for business with Iran. The second group are those companies who have exposure to US interests and are vulnerable potentially to US sanctions, but who will feel that what the EU is offering, for example, in financing solutions or in risk management, sanctions risk mitigation, would be good enough for them to continue their Iran business. And a third group are potentially smaller and medium-sized companies who have either no or very limited exposure to the US market, who may feel that continuing their Iran business is more to their advantage.
Could China take advantage of this then? Could they be the big winner in all of this? I mean, we're talking, of course, about the second biggest economy in the world, a huge buyer of oil as well.
China will certainly benefit from the current development. But I would argue that the biggest winner in the process will be Russia. The new phenomenon in Iran is the emergence of Russian investments and Russian projects in Iran. For example, about a month ago, Iran, for the very first time, awarded an upstream oil project to a Russian company. They had never done that before. They had awarded it to Chinese, to Indians, to Europeans, but never to Russians. Russians would always get smaller subcontracting service contracts, but not a prime contract. For the first time, there was a prime contract, and there are others on the horizon. I would say Russia will benefit most from a withdrawal from Iran by European and other international companies.
Good to speak with you. Bijan Khajapour, thanks for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Now, a heavy rainy season has destroyed large stretches of farmland in Kenya and displaced over 250,000 people. Agriculture is a big employer there. Andrew Simmons has traveled to Kilifi County to meet farmers who lost their land to the River Sabaki.
Nothing could stop the Sabaki River from destroying land that provided people with something near to self-sufficiency. An abundance of fruit and vegetables used to grow here in fertile soil. That's been replaced by silty sand. These are only a few of the farmers who have lost their livelihoods.
My land was around the corner there. I had 6 acres.
Like everyone else, Valentin Katana has no insurance to cover his losses.
So that land was my everything. The 6 acres was my everything. Schooling of my children, all the cash I get from that land.
In one of the places that escaped the floods, this is how it should be. 2 crops of maize a year. The people may be poor, but it's rich land. The original course of this river was right over there beside the tree line. It didn't just burst its banks, it changed course completely, surging right across this land, destroying homes, farms, and all of the crops. The danger now is that the force is here, right across this bank. A short distance away, this family is afraid they could lose everything too. The floods are changing lives, making more people dependent on aid right now. Longer term, many will consider moving to towns, following the path of urbanization. The nearest town is Malindi, and jobs here are hard to find. Back beside the Sabaki River, it's raining again, and these farmers want the Kenya government to do more.
The situation now is bad. Everybody's crying here. Not only one family, about 1,000 families are crying because they lost everything. It's a desert now. As you can see now, it's a desert. So many people are crying out there because they're all depending on this place.
The aid agencies that people are now dependent on are hard-pressed to meet demand, and the government is coming under heavier pressure to devote more resources to the crisis.
All right, still to come on Counting the Cost. Could tourism outshine mining as a potential big employer in South Africa? But first, ongoing strikes at Air France KLM have cost Europe's 4th largest airline more than $350 million so far this year. The CEO also said he's stepping down after the breakdown of talks with unions. The French government said the airline needs reforms or it may not survive. 1 year on from Emmanuel Macron's historic election win, public opinion is divided on France's youngest president and how he's handled the powerful unions. Natasha Butler has more from Paris.
In 1 year, Emmanuel Macron has rocketed from relative obscurity to international prominence. The French president has bounded onto the world stage, taking a lead on climate change, the Iran deal and Europe. His strategy is to speak to everyone, even those he disagrees with.
We have to make him perfect. He is perfect.
Some analysts say that so far the results are mixed.
We have to give points to Macron for having this kind of close, engaging relationship with other world leaders. Then when you measure the results, there are different questions. On the Iran deal, on trade tariffs, on climate, these are areas where Macron's vision has not prevailed, at least for now.
While Macron is being celebrated abroad, back home it's a different story. Anger's been growing over the president's sweeping reform agenda. For months, rail and public sector workers have staged strikes and protests. Macron says the changes will modernise France and create opportunity. But at an anti-Macron rally in Paris, people said he's destroying rights and hurting the poor.
Emmanuel Macron's politics are outrageously unfair. He's like a reverse Robin Hood. He robs the poor and gives to the rich.
It was in the elegant surroundings of the Louvre that 1 year ago Emmanuel Macron celebrated his victory. Since then, he has been dividing public opinion. On one hand, there are those who say that his policies are hurting some of the most vulnerable in society. But there are others who believe that he's exactly the kind of dynamic president that France needs.
For his supporters, the youngest French leader since Napoleon is a visionary.
We have seen an economic revolution, political and social revolution, and one that is constructive, not destructive.
Macron wants France to be an innovation leader. Shortly after his election, he inaugurated this tech startup hub in Paris. Today, it lures international entrepreneurs.
So there's a lot more happening in France in the startup ecosystem, and that was one of the reasons for me to still consider to stay in France to build my company.
Under Macron, the unemployment rate is down, investments picking up, and public approval for the strikers is falling. But the president has not won his battle yet. His urge to reform all parts of society quickly may create more opponents, yet it's unlikely to deter him. Macron's repeatedly said that he cares little for popularity.
Argentina is once again looking for a financial lifeline from the International Monetary Fund. Interest rates hit 40% there this week, but many Argentines still remember the role the IMF played in the last financial crisis in 2001. Teresa Bo reports from Buenos Aires.
Protests in Buenos Aires against the government of Mauricio Macri. It is against a recent raise in the price of utility services, but also against the recent announcement of a request of financial help of the International Monetary Fund.
This cannot continue. The government has raised the prices of utility services as never before, and now an agreement with the IMF. We know what happens when we deal with the IMF. It has never ended well.
Most Argentines are shocked with the news that the government is seeking financial help from the International Monetary Fund, because it brings back memories of what happened 17 years ago when Argentina defaulted on its sovereign debt and entered one of the worst crises in this country's history. Many fear that an agreement with the IMF will result in harsher austerity measures that will hurt this country's most vulnerable.
Argentina is trying to cope with the devaluation of the peso currency and capital flight because of a strengthening US dollar. It is affecting emerging markets, and especially a vulnerable country like Argentina that has been struggling with double-digit inflation rates and deficit for years.
We understand that these days people are upset, afraid that this situation will end up in a crisis like the ones we've seen in the past, or that it's going to stop the process of change that we are going through right now. We have a strong conviction that what we are doing will end up in development and growth that we've been waiting for years.
Macri says he's trying a gradual approach to reduce the deficit, but for many his announcement is like going back in time. Gabriel Rubinstein was part of the team that helped Argentina negotiate with the world after the crisis in 2001.
Argentina is being cautious with what is happening in the world and is trying to get ready if the situation gets worse. The government has a clear road, but it's not enough if your macroeconomy is not working. Macri said inflation was going to be 20% in 2016, and it was actually 40%. They did not believe that a rise in tariffs would worsen inflation.
Without credibility, Argentina is facing economic uncertainty once again. And while the government is asking for international help, on the streets, people are trying to make sure that economic austerity won't come at their expense.
Joining us now from London is Edward Glossop, Latin America economist at Capital Economics. Good to speak with you. So I guess the obvious question here is, after everything that Argentines went through with the IMF 17 years ago and the pain that so many of them felt there, why is Argentina again turning to the IMF for help now?
Well, there are two reasons for that, quite simply. One is the huge fiscal deficit. The budget deficit is huge at about 6.5% of GDP. That has a counterpart in the large current account deficit, which is about 5% of GDP. And the second reason is high inflation. Inflation is still running at about 25% year on year. And so, as well as all that, you also have high levels of dollar-denominated foreign currency debts, which, as the peso continues to fall, the cost of servicing those debts rises in local currency terms.
And how's the IMF going to approach this then? I mean, have they learned anything from the previous experience with Argentina? Is there a chance that they will temper their conditions a little?
Possibly. That's a question for the IMF, but I think certainly if you look at Argentina's balance sheet and the latest comments from the IMF, it's certainly the case that I think they're probably pushing for a traditional bailout, so an SBA agreement, rather than a flexible credit line or a precautionary liquidity line, which were mooted by Macron early on this week. So I think from the IMF standpoint, they're probably going to be pushing for a more full-blown bailout, regardless of what's happened in the past.
So what are the pitfalls of this then?
Well, the pitfalls are that in our view, the negotiations are probably long and quite drawn out, because you have this difficult issue where the IMF is probably pushing for a standby agreement and a traditional bailout, but that's a difficult sell politically for President Macron, and it's unlikely, in our view, to pass Argentina's Congress. So that raises the prospect of these long and drawn-out negotiations, which raises the risk that we see the currency crisis kind of escalate again, which of course exacerbates all of the problems.
And talking about those problems, just taking a step back here for a moment, how did Argentina get to this point? Was it the Kirchner years, the years of protectionism and high government spending and all of the rest of it?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think there's probably two things to say on that. One is that the sort of seeds of the current crisis, if you like, or mini currency crisis, were obviously sown during the Kirchner years, the two successive Kirchner governments, where fiscal policy was extremely loose, balance of payments pressure started to build, and high inflation was entrenched. And the second reason, I think, is that President Macron, for all this sort of rhetoric and the optimism in financial markets, he simply hasn't made enough progress or moved quickly enough to actually address these underlying economic vulnerabilities. Financial markets were extremely upbeat and optimistic about Argentina's prospects when Macron came to office. But it was an extremely difficult task that he had on his hands, and we don't think he's moved as aggressively enough or quickly enough in order to address these economic vulnerabilities that still exist.
Edward Glossop, good to speak with you. Thanks for your time.
Thank you.
And finally, one of the world's fastest growing tourist destinations, South Africa, hosted the continent's biggest travel trade show this week. But another key industry is hurting the growth of the tourism sector. Al Jazeera's Malcolm Webb reports from Matuba.
It's the first time the Madikizela family has visited a wildlife park. The Hluhluwe Mfolozi Park's a few hours' drive from their home in South Africa. It's the continent's oldest reserve, famous for its zebra, leopards and herds of endangered white rhino.
It's been beautiful, it's a great experience to see these things live, other than seeing them in television.
The park's wildlife and vast stretches of untouched wilderness attract tens of thousands of visitors from all over the world every year. Most of the surrounding countryside is also pristine, but not all of it. Just 4 kilometres from the park is this, an open cast coal mine. It's been here for more than 10 years, and the company that runs it now wants to expand right up to the park's boundary. People living around here complain of the frequent blasting and coal dust. And in the park, the manager says if the mine comes into its buffer zone, it'll be disastrous.
We've got elephants which are sensitive to sound, we've got crocodiles, so if there's disturbance, elephants cannot communicate. If there's disturbance and explosives, crocodiles will abandon their nests and so forth. This wilderness area, once it's gone, you will never recover it.
The managers of the mining company, called Tendele, say they're looking into using digging machines instead of blasting. And they say they employ more than 1,000 people from the community, and more if they expand. The tourism creates thousands of jobs in the surrounding area, selling services and goods such as handcrafts, as well as the 1,600 people employed in the park itself. Jobs that conservationists say are under threat if the mine expands. The municipal mayor doesn't agree. He backs the expansion.
If 42% of our youth is unemployed, it's a time-ticking bomb. If sectors come in around Mtuba, they just negotiate and see how they're going to help our people. Because we want to see them getting job opportunities, putting food on the table.
Tendele's coal mine's one of many cases in South Africa and across the continent where mining conflicts with conservation and the tourism it brings. Extractive industries make up about 30% of Africa's GDP, about 4 times as much as tourism, but campaigners say the sector's blighted by corruption and benefits far fewer people. Back in the park, people working here hope the mining won't drive the wildlife away, and with it, the tourists and their jobs.
And that's our show for this week. As always, you can get in touch with us by tweeting me at Hazim Seeker and use the hashtag AJCTC when you do, or drop us an email. countingthecost@aljazeera.net is our address. There's more for you online at aljazeera.com/CTC. That'll take you straight to our page, which has individual reports, links, and entire episodes for you to catch up on. That's it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Hazim Seeker from the whole team here. Thanks for joining us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.